Hello, everyone, and welcome to Professional Previews. My name is Michael Lewis, and today I am joined here by Dr. Brittany Hunt, who will introduce herself a little bit more in just a second. If this is your first time joining us for Professional Previews, here's a little bit about the program. This program is designed to give you a look into the everyday lives of STEAM professionals and also learn about how they got to where they are in their current field. And so just a couple of notes, feel free to drop any questions you have inside of the chat. We will get to those periodically. At the very end of the program, we will stop the recording and you will have the opportunity to speak directly to our speaker. And you can also turn on your cameras and unmute yourself then as well. Also, auto-generated captions are available. If you want to activate those in the Zoom call, they'll be at the very bottom of your screen. And yeah, so let's hop on over to Dr. Brittany Hunt. And so Dr. Hunt, would you introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about who you are and what you're doing.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Michael. Hi, everyone. My name is Dr. Brittany Danielle Hunt. I'm a member of the Lumbee Tribe of North Carolina. I'm a graduate of Duke University, where I got my undergraduate degree or my bachelor's in psychology, and a graduate of UNC Chapel Hill, where I got my master's in social work, and also from UNC Charlotte, where I got my PhD in curriculum and instruction. I'm currently an assistant professor of education at Virginia Tech. Working remotely from Charlotte. So I'm joining you from Charlotte currently, and I am on Catawba, the traditional or the ancestral homelands of the Catawba Nation. I'm a member of the Lumbee tribe. Not sure if I mentioned that earlier. The Lumbee tribe were the largest tribe east of the Mississippi River, the largest tribe in North Carolina, and mostly residing in Robeson County, North Carolina, which is where I grew up and where I was born and raised, and until I left when I was 18 to go to college. Would you like me to say a little bit more about my career at this time, or should I wait for questions?
Yeah, go ahead and tell us about a couple of things that you've been doing. I know that you mentioned in your bio that you have a podcast and you have also written a book called Who's Your People? And so if you could tell us a little bit about that and what you're currently doing at Virginia.
Yeah. So at Virginia Tech, my research mostly focuses on, or in general, my research mostly focuses on the ways that Indigenous people are erased from modern day curriculum in the United States. If you take a moment to reflect on what you learned about Indigenous people when you were all in school, most of us learned about Columbus, the Thanksgiving story, and then the Trail of Tears. And then Indigenous people are kind of left at that point in history. So in around the 1800s. And most people don't really think of Indigenous people as being a part of America today. They think of us as being a part of maybe the history of America, but not necessarily of America in the contemporary or even the future. So Indigenous people are kind of left in the past. And so my research really focuses on the ways that Indigenous histories are erased, and also the ways that Indigenous histories are taught from a context of stereotypes. So stereotypes of Indigenous people being helpers, being willing to help, willing to move from their traditional homelands, just willing to do whatever colonizers required them to do. Or also the kind of contradictory stereotype of Indigenous people being savage or primitive or dangerous. And so kind of these two different narratives competing at the same time. So, and also those are kind of reified by mascots that are still in schools today. And so a lot of my research focuses on those types of things. I also have a podcast called the Red Justice Project, and that podcast focuses on the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous people in the Americas, but we mostly focus specifically on Robeson County, North Carolina, which I mentioned earlier is the where most Lumbee people reside today. And there are more than 65,000 or 70,000 Lumbee people in the United States, and most of them are living in Robeson County. Robeson County actually has a higher violent crime rate than both Chicago and New York City. And so there's a lot of violence that's happening in the county, a lot of murders of Indigenous women specifically, but also Indigenous men. And so most of our podcast focuses on that area, but we also have covered some cases in Canada and some cases of boarding schools or residential schools. I also have a children's book called Who's Your People. So even though a lot of my work focuses on the issue of I think Indigenous pain or trauma, I also try to focus on the very necessary element of Indigenous joy and happiness and love and humor and resilience. And so my book, Who's Your People, is a children's book. The title, Who's Your People, comes from a very common Lumbee phrase. So if you meet if a Lumbee meets another Lumbee for the first time, we'll typically ask, who's your people? Because we want to know, like, who's your grandma, who's your granddaddy, how are we connected to each other? Or do we have a common relative? Do we know someone in common? It's very much about establishing a connection between two people. Whereas I think in American culture, oftentimes people will ask for the first, if they meet you for the first time, they'll ask, what do you do for work? Which kind of establishes a hierarchy between the two people and is not really necessarily connective, or kind of focuses on elements of labor. And the Who's Your People is much more about just like relationality. And so the title of the book, I say all that to say that the title of the book is that, and it's about a young Lumbee boy who's leaving his he was born and raised in Baltimore, Maryland, which there's a significant portion of Lumbees who live in Baltimore, Maryland. Actually, my mom was born there. A lot of Lumbees moved there during the 50s and 60s. And so there's like a Lumbee cultural center there, and there's a Lumbee church. And so there's a significant portion of Lumbees. So he's moving from Baltimore back to Robeson County, where his parents are from. And he's nervous on his first day of school that he won't know anyone and that no one will talk to him. But then as soon as he goes to school, the janitor knows his mama, and then one of the teachers knows his dad, and then an elder comes in who knows his whole family, and then his cousin is on the playground and welcomes him to play with her. And so he realizes that he's moving back to a community that's ready to accept him, and all these different people are asking him, like, who's your people, or saying, I know your people. And so it's very important for me as a part of my research to also, again, focus on elements of Indigenous joy and connection. Because I think that's one of the most important things to Indigenous people is family and community. So I try to have complementary elements to my work that doesn't just focus on suffering, but also, again, on joy and happiness. Also, another thing about my research is I think it's really important to write articles for whenever you're in academia. So as an assistant professor, I have to always be like kind of doing research or publishing articles in order to get tenure. But a lot of times, like 5 people will read an article that it took you like 2 years to write and get published. And so you don't really have a lot of I guess, reward for your time sometimes. But when writing things like a children's book or having a podcast helps you get access to a much wider audience. So I've had significantly more readers of my children's book and also listeners of my podcast than I've ever really gotten on articles that I've published. And so it's really important for me to create in general things that are accessible to the general public, as opposed to articles which can feel really inaccessible for folks. So that's a really big core part of my own research and my own work as well. A little bit about how I got to, and I'm not sure if you'll ask that later, Michael, so sorry if I'm jumping the gun, but how I got to this work was kind of through trauma, I guess. So I'm from Lumberton, North Carolina, again, from Robeson County. Most Lumbees we represent like our county more than like our town. I don't know. It's weird. And most people don't like say, I'm from a specific county, you know. But in Robeson County, the population of Indigenous people there is about 40%. In some areas and some like communities are like 99% Lumbee. So I grew up in a place that had a really high Indigenous population. My entire street were mostly Lumbee people. My church was mostly Lumbee. Most of my friends were Lumbee. So I came from a very, very Lumbee community and Lumbee place. And then I went to Duke for college. And I was literally the only Lumbee on campus. There was no other Lumbee students. There was not even another person from my county there. There were no Native professors at all. So not even just Lumbee now. There were no Native professors, no Native faculty, no Native staff. And so I went from this context of being surrounded by Indigenous people all the time to then being, again, literally the only Indigenous person in almost every single space that I was in on campus every single day. The only time I really saw other Native people is when I went to the Native American Student Association meetings, which were held about once a month. and there was only about 4 Native people who were in that organization. And Duke had a very, very small Indigenous population. I think it was 0.01% when I was there. So again, very small. So my context shifted dramatically in a very, very short amount of time. And I was not prepared for that. And people also were not prepared for me. So when I would tell people I was Native, they would always ask me things like, well, what part Native are you? Like as if I'm not fully Indigenous. Or they would ask me if I was sure I was Native, or they would ask me how much Black or how much white I was. And people always assumed that I was biracial or Hispanic or whatever else. And so people were very, very reluctant to believe me. And they thought that I should look like or sound like the Indigenous people that they had seen in movies. So like Pocahontas, the cartoon, which no one can look like that. It's kind of like what they honestly expected me to be like. So people would say, you know, they really fundamentally believed that I lived in a teepee when I went back to my home community. I remember doing a talk once for kindergartners. This was a few years ago. And they asked me, how did I get there? Like, how did I actually get to the school? Because they thought that I rode a horse to get to the school. And then I had on like a turtleneck that I had gotten from H&M, and someone asked me, did I make my clothes? I mean, because so they very much assumed that Indigenous people live in a very, I don't want to say primitive, because it's not necessarily primitive to make your own clothes, but in a certain kind of way that they kind of typecasted me or boxed me into. And that's with the kindergartners that I've worked with before, all the way up to these supposedly super smart kids that I went to school with at Duke. And so, you know, there was not really a lot of difference between the way kindergartners thought about me and the way college students thought. And so I began to reflect on my own experiences in school, thinking about what I learned about Indigenous people, even in a school system that was predominantly Indigenous. I learned the same thing: Columbus, Thanksgiving, Trail of Tears. I never, ever once learned about Indigenous people past the 1850s. I mean, we were totally left there, even though I had Native teachers in school, I had Native principals. Still, we were kind of left in the past in the context of my school system. So I was thinking, if that's what I learned, and I had Native teachers, and I lived in a Native community, how much less do folks learn who are not in communities like that and who don't have Native teachers? And I'm not saying that to say that I excuse some of the comments that people made to me, because some of them were truly horrible or horrific. But there is some understanding, I think, there. And then to complement what we're not learning in the classroom, there's this element from the media. So the only Native representations in film and TV during this time were Pocahontas, Dances with Wolves, Last of the Mohicans. And so those are all, again, from the context of Indigenous people being historical, but also like these stereotypes of Indigenous people being helpers. So like Pocahontas is like constructed as like a helper for John Smith, or like a savior for him, or she's willing to sacrifice her own body for him. In Dances with Wolves, we needed, or Indigenous people needed Kevin Costner to save the day. Same thing with The Last of the Mohicans with Daniel Day-Lewis. So Indigenous people are kind of constructed as being helpless, and needing this usually needing a white savior in those contexts, but also being kind of primitive or savage, or, you know, super connected with nature. And so those are things that people thought I should be like and sound like and look like whenever I was at school. And so my work really does focus on helping teachers and people in general to kind of undo and untangle some of the stereotypes that they've internalized unknowingly. And so, yeah, that was a really long-winded answer, but that's kind of how I came to the work that I'm doing now.
No, yeah, I definitely appreciate you going into that deep dive of you know, what kind of sparked that interest that you're doing now into what you're doing now. And so you mentioned that, you know, going to Duke, you became the only. You went from being one person within this community of many other people who are like you and grew up like you, and you know, you felt this very close sense of community, to being completely isolated. So as someone who also knows what it's like to be the only, you are often asked to be the spokesperson for
Right.
your people. Even if you're not asked to, you are kind of elected to be. So, do you view that as being more problematic or more empowering because you do have that opportunity to then educate people and correct them on their biases or their misunderstandings or misconceptions?
I think it depends. For me, I had never even really thought about what it meant to be Indigenous before going to Duke because I never really had to think about it. Because again, I was surrounded by Indigenous people all the time. And so it's a great luxury to not have to really constantly be aware of it in certain spaces. Um, but so I was 18 and having to answer these like deep questions about identity and race that I had never really thought about before. And I was totally unprepared for that. So when I would say at that time for me, it was definitely not a good thing because I didn't know what to say. Sometimes I would laugh off the comments people would make. Sometimes I would make a rude comment back. Sometimes I wouldn't say anything at all. And then I would end up like, you know how at night you're like you're laying in bed thinking like I should have said this or I should have like cussed them out or like I should have, you think of this the most clever retort after the fact. And so that's kind of how it was for me. I was like, oh, I should have said this or I should have defended myself. And even now today, I'll still think about certain things people said to me and wish I had said more or said something a specific way. So for me at that time, it definitely was not a good thing. I wasn't prepared. I didn't have the language. I also was just wanting to make friends and have a community and not wanting to answer these like deep questions about Indigenous identity politics that again, I hadn't really began to grapple with all the way. So for me, it was not, again, not a good thing. Now it's a little bit of both. There are times where I almost dread telling someone that I'm Native because I know what's going to come next. They're either not going to believe me or they're going to tell me that their great grandma was Cherokee. That actually just happened to me this week. I was telling someone that I was Native and I was like, oh God. And then she told me her great grandma was Cherokee. And then it happened to me 2 months before that. And that's kind of like a recurring theme for Indigenous people when you tell someone you're Native, they either don't believe you or they'll tell you that they're Native too through their mythological great grandmother. It's always the great grandma and it's always Cherokee. Very rarely does it deviate. And if it does, I'm typically quick to be like, okay, yeah, you're probably Indigenous. So it's like people don't get reminded that they're Native until they meet me. But for me, I always am hyper aware of my indigeneity. So yeah, I don't know. I guess it can be good in certain times with certain people if they're willing to be open to the conversation and to be non-problematic. But most of the time, people are super problematic because of what they've learned about Indigenous people.
Mhm. And so the advice that I try to live by every day is to be the person you needed when you were younger. So if you could talk to, 18-year-old Brittany, what what would be some of the things that you would want to say to her and, kind of guide her in how to handle those interactions?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I wish that I would have been much more assertive with my comments sometimes so that I kind of nip some things in the bud. Because sometimes, even amongst my friend group in college, they would make like jokes about me being Native that I would try to like laugh off because they're my friends. I still want to have friends. But I wish I would have been more assertive in like nipping those kind of comments in the bud because they were really harmful for me at that time. I think more harmful than I even realized. So I wish I would have again been more assertive. I wish I would have been prepared for the reality I was about to enter into. I had not considered that I would be the only Native or in all of my classes that I ever took at Duke. I was the only Native person. There was never any other Indigenous people in my classes. Um, I was not really prepared for that. So I wish I would have had a little bit of preparation. Even code switching was something that I had to start doing that I had never done before. So it's not really apparent now because I'm code switching now, but I have a very, very strong Indigenous dialect or Lumbee dialect when I'm speaking to my family, that I've had to learn to kind of tamper down into just like a Southern accent. But Lumbee dialect is a lot different. It's still Southern, but it's very unique. And I had to learn to tamper it down because people would think it was hilarious, or they would ask me to repeat words all the time. And it just became really annoying, and it resulted in me never speaking in class. And so I even had meetings with professors where they were trying to figure out how to encourage me to speak in class, but I felt so uncomfortable talking in class. And so I had to learn to code switch so that I could pass my classes and like not get laughed at all the time. So yeah, if I could talk to my younger self, I would maybe say, you don't have to do that, there are ways that you can like quickly nip this in the bud.
Mm. Yeah, and then Hannah asks a good question in the chat. Is there a specific age group that you focus your work on, and what tends to be the best strategy to connect with them? So this is, kind of, you are acting as that person you needed when you were younger, especially if you're working with younger kids or whatnot. You're being this beacon of representation of, hey, look, I am this great person. You can be great too. Yeah.
Yeah. So I've done presentations for all different age groups, all the way down from kindergarten up to 12th grade. I prefer to work with like 6th grade and up, but sometimes the 8th graders can be like, I don't know, really immature. I don't know. It's really interesting. Like 4th graders are sometimes more mature than 5th graders. The 7th graders are more mature than 8th. So sometimes in presentations, kids will just make really weird or strange comments at the end that they know are strange or weird comments. I've worked with all different age groups. It's easier to work with kids the older that they are though, in general. So like I prefer probably high school. But I also really enjoy working with college students. So teaching is a big passion of mine, which is why I'm a professor. But yeah, I really enjoy working with college age students as well. But also, again, working with teachers, I really think that can help with a lot of these issues, helping them revise their curriculum or revise the kind of content that they're teaching about Indigenous people, not just teaching Indigeneity as like a lesson, but incorporating Indigenous knowledge into all different lessons that they're teaching. So not doing like necessarily like separate conversations about Indigenous people, but like if you're teaching about the Civil War, Indigenous people fought in the Civil War, teaching about, infusing us in all different conversations, or the Civil Rights Movement, or land issues, water issues. Those are all contemporary things Indigenous people are kind of fighting against. And so making sure to teach about Indigenous people throughout the context of history and modernity, and not as like a singular lesson during Thanksgiving, right?
Right. Yeah, and so that kind of ties to this next question of how do the stereotypes of Indigenous people play into the roles of science? So, as you mentioned, there's this kind of antiquated, or like Indigenous peoples are only stuck in the past, like they're only using bow and arrows, and all of these other stereotypes that we only see in the media. But how does that intertwine? How does that identity intertwine with science that is being done?
Yeah, there's a fantastic book called Braiding Sweetgrass, which I'd recommend everyone read. It's about a lot of Indigenous and science type related issues. My specific research does not necessarily focus so much on science. However, my last boss was a hydrologist, and so we merged a lot of his scientific interests with my own Indigenous interests, and he's also Indigenous as well. And so our last research project focused on the ways that on the knowledge that environmental professionals have specifically about Indigenous people, and then how that could be possibly impacting their work. if let's say as an environmental professional, the lands that you're tasked with working on have indigenous people in those areas, but you don't know that indigenous people are even still alive, then you may not do any kind of consultation with indigenous people about water issues or land issues or any issues with trees or forestation. And so I think that indigenous people often get ignored, even when their lands are the ones that are up for discussion and their waters. And so that's one specific way. And then I can also share one specific story from college that does relate to science. I worked at a library, and I usually would work the late night shifts because they would pay like double money. So I was like all about that cash. And but during the late night shifts, though, we would always have a security guard who would sit at the desk with us. So from like 12 to like 6 in the morning, you would have a security guard there. And so I would talk to them because I was always working the late nights usually. And I remember once I was talking to one of the security guards, and he was asking me where I was from. And I told him I was from Lumberton. And he said, "Oh yeah, I've heard of Lumberton. He's like, they have some Lumberton Indians there. And I read that they have smaller brains than the rest of the population." And so he said he had actually read a research study that said that Lumbees have smaller brains than the average American. And I'm not sure if that's a real research study. I don't know, but I do know that there's a lot of scientific racism that happens specifically with BIPOC people and indigenous people too, obviously. And so there is this belief that our differences are rooted in science, which then will in turn kind of legitimize unfair treatment of indigenous people. So like if you as a security guard or as a doctor fundamentally believe that indigenous people have smaller brains and are less intelligent, what kind of conversations are you going to have with your indigenous patients? What kind of care or treatment are you going to provide to them? And so that was one of the most, I think, shocking examples of like racist ideology that I've like personally experienced when I was at Duke or when I was a student in general. There are also issues of hair, which I think relate in a lot of ways to indigenous science. There are a lot of indigenous tribes that believe that a person's hair is connected to their spine, and it's like a sacred part of who they are and how they conceive of themselves as indigenous. So it's beyond just like a cultural thing. It's like becomes scientific and physical. And there's a school right now in North Carolina called the Classical Charter School, which is trying to force indigenous boys who have long braids down their back to cut their hair. And so there was a meeting last night where one of the school board members said, "The feathers are here." And she was referring to the indigenous people who were in the room. And she ended up having this like, just making horrific comments about indigenous people throughout the meeting. And so in schools, requiring boys to not have long hair, like what does that mean for your body? What does that mean for your mind or for your spirit? And how are all of these things kind of interconnected with science? I think sometimes we think of science as just being like facts and like, I don't know, things that we can see and things that we know, but then science has a whole other realm to it that is so much more than just what we see and what we can observe. And so I think hair is all connected to that as well. And so, yeah, that's definitely one issue that indigenous people are facing in the state.
Yeah, and everyone, especially within the field of science, likes to think that science is the most objective thing ever.
Right.
There's no biases, there's not racism, there's not sexism, there's not this, there's not that in science, because it is supposed to be looking at everything from this bird's eye view, and these are the facts and these are only the facts. But science and even the scientific method in and of itself, it can be rooted in imperialism and
Right.
all of these other things. If you look at anatomy textbooks, like 99 times out of 100, it wasn't until very recently that they were showing bodies that weren't white
Right.
men and women in anatomy textbooks. And as you were mentioning with the myth that Lumbee people have smaller brains, and that's been perpetuated through all sorts of other things within science, of saying
Right.
that Black patients are more are more aggressive, or they are less intelligent, so you have to explain things over to them, or
Where they
whatever.
don't
So
feel
yeah,
pain as much.
yes, they
Yeah,
don't, they have thicker skin, and like there
yeah.
are all of these things, and even new generations of doctors and people who are going into medical school are still learning these from their professors, from the people who they are doing their residency under, even though there's been numerous studies that completely dis, you know, dis, discredit those notions. So, that is a great example as to why we do need these voices of everyone here to be like, this, what do you mean? And it can be really awkward. I know it in that situation. I don't know how you handle that with that security officer, but if that's the person that you have to work with every day,
Right.
and you're one on one, that isn't necessarily the time that you want to be super aggressive about certain things, because
Right.
or aggressive, even if you're just correcting them on a misunderstanding,
Right.
because it can be misconstrued and cause a lot of tension.
For sure.
Um, so yeah, so thank you for sharing those experiences.
Yeah.
Um, and so you mentioned that you do a lot of research about people's perceptions of Indigenous people. So what does that research look like? How do you conduct that? How is this qualitative, quantitative? I know that you and I first met when you were doing one of those kind of talking sessions where we were all sharing out things, but what does that typically look like?
Yeah, I love to do talking circles. So just for a little bit of background on talking circles, for those who aren't familiar, you assemble yourselves in a circle, obviously, and then you have a talking stick or an item. And so usually the person who is leading the circle will ask a question, and then they'll pass the item to either the left or the right, and whoever has the item in their hand is the only one who's supposed to speak during that time. And then they'll keep passing it around the circle so that it kind of gives everyone a chance to share, which is really good for people who are shy, or people who are maybe less likely to raise their hand. But it's also really good for those who are monopolizers in a space and who maybe sometimes talk a little too much. It helps them to listen more. So I really love talking circles. They're actually an Indigenous practice that were created by Indigenous people to solve issues in their community or to make major decisions amongst the tribe. And so I really like using those because it gives kind of a lot of time for listening, but also time for sharing. So I use those because they can help take some of the pressure off when sharing like difficult conversations, or when sharing maybe things that people are a little bit embarrassed about. I mean, I think sometimes it can feel a little bit, I don't know if embarrassing is the right word, but you feel maybe a little bit cheated sometimes when you think about your educational history. Like, why didn't I learn about certain things when I was in school? Like, you know, why did I not learn anything about Indigenous people past the 1800s? Or why did I learn that Pocahontas was a grown woman when she met John Smith? Or like, why did I learn the Thanksgiving story was this happy time? Or why did I learn Columbus was this wonderful, wonderful, noble person, right? So it can feel kind of uncomfortable when we learn that a lot of the things that we were taught are just blatantly false. And so I like using talking circles when I have a group because it can help, again, take some of the pressure off. But also a lot of my research came about just from having conversations with people one-on-one. So I would, when I was in my program at UNC Charlotte, a lot of the people in the program were teachers or principals. And so I remember asking a principal once, what kind of things are y'all planning to do for Native American Heritage Month at your school? And one of the things that she told me that they were planning to do was to have these, she taught, or she was a principal at an elementary school, and she was going to have the students, she was planning this she had these cartoon cutouts, or like a cartoon coloring sheet. And it was of Indigenous people. And she was going to have them, color the photos. And then she also was going to have them bring in photographs of their family members. And she was going to have them cut out the faces of their families and paste them on top of the cartoon cutouts of Indigenous people to make them into Indigenous people, I never totally understood the activity, but she said a teacher spoke out against it once. And so the principal decided to call, they have a Native American Heritage Museum in DC, and she wanted to call and find out some advice about, the project that she was planning. And they told her, ma'am, please cease and desist. Like, don't do this project. This is very inappropriate. It's teaching kids that like anybody can be Indigenous, or that Indigenous people are replaceable, or I'm not really sure what she was getting at, but she told me that she still did the assignment or the activity because she had already printed off the papers and bought the glue and the scissors. So those are the kind of stories that I hear from, again, this is a person who was in a doctoral program with me, who was getting her PhD, who's a principal. So she's already probably very well educated in general. And so I get a lot of my research from conversations with folks, conversations with teachers, with principals. It's hard sometimes not to be like, hey, you shouldn't be doing that. That's very traumatic for students. But it really is eye-opening, because some of the things that I learned that I thought were bad in school, I learned are almost nothing compared to, again, what PhD holding principals are doing in their schools.
Yeah, and as a person who has been in the field of science for essentially my entire life, and one of the things that I like to do is to connect marginalized and underrepresented groups of people to the field of science. And a lot of times, teachers or professors who I've had talk about the difficulties that they have with like even communicating or doing things with groups of students, because they just don't want to do anything. They don't have a work ethic or whatever. And it's, if you're going in with that stereotype, then you are already biasing these students before you even have the chance to meet them. And there's also this layer of mistrust, because for so long, a lot of these students have been treated in such a way by those people of authority, by teachers or professors or anyone in power, that they don't feel like they can trust it. They don't feel like they can do these things because they've been told, their entire lives that they can't do something. And so I know that me going and doing things like, again, I look like a lot of the students who I want to reach out to. So have you noticed that it is easier to do research? I don't know if you've done research like back at home in Lumberton. Have you heard stories about it being easier for you to do it versus a colleague, or anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a long history of non-native researchers going into native communities and doing really problematic and harmful research, which in turn makes indigenous people really reluctant to trust any kind of researcher or even medical professionals or professors in general, or people in academia in general. And I also think a lot of times researchers come in with specific agendas, and they think that they know what indigenous people care about or what indigenous people should care about. Whereas a lot of times your research should be flipped the other way. You should find out what are the needs in indigenous communities, or what are the strengths, and how can you leverage those while maybe addressing the needs, or what are the correct things to focus on. For example, I see a lot of research that focuses on like alcoholism in indigenous communities, when indigenous people are actually, white Americans are more likely to have problems with alcoholism than indigenous people, but you don't really see like tons of research on that, for example. And so coming in with these preconceived notions of what indigenous people are, or what the issues are in their community, which a lot of times can be really far off base. So for me, I do think it's been easier for me to do research than a non-indigenous person, because I come in with a massive amount of knowledge of my own community and the right ways to ask questions. Or I did research once with 2 different Native moms about like rearing practices that they use with their children. And I remember I went to one of the mom's house, and she made me some, I don't know how this would be called, but what we call it is tater bread. I don't know if that's something that other people eat and it's made out of sweet potatoes. And she had some that she had just taken out of the oven, and we shared it together. And so we shared a little meal, and then we started talking about other things, and then we started talking about the research. Whereas I think sometimes researchers are like jumping in, like, tell me about your most traumatic memory, you know? And so for us, it's again more about establishing a connection with each other first, and then getting into maybe some questions later. So it kind of goes back to the who's your people thing from earlier. Like
Yeah,
we need to we need to have some tater bread first before we
yeah,
can get into this conversation about how you raise your kid, right?
right.
Um, so there's like establishing this trust, establishing rapport, which is really important. Whereas I think sometimes traditional or like Western research is so much about keeping like the subject totally separate from the researcher. Whereas Indigenous communities, it's not something that we would do. So yeah, I definitely do think it's been easier for me, but also much more responsibility.
Yes, yeah. And Hannah asked a really good question. How can we best avoid typecasting all Native communities? Even in progressive spaces that are becoming more inclusive, they still tend to group all Indigenous Americans into one cohort of people.
Yes, that's such a big problem, I think, for Indigenous people in general. I even read land acknowledgements are becoming really popular right now, where you people will like acknowledge land before doing something, which they can be good and they can be bad at the same time, because sometimes they're just performative, and sometimes that's the only way a person acknowledges Indigenous people throughout the entire measure of their research or their work, and that's not really helping Indigenous people if you just say this is the land that they were on and then you don't at all acknowledge them in the future. um but I say all that to say that I had a professor once who did a land acknowledgement, and she didn't acknowledge any Indigenous people. She just said, we acknowledge the Indigenous people who were on this land before, but she didn't say the specific tribe. So it's like, that's really dumb, actually. But it's important for people to, when you think about Indigenous nations, think about how different a person from like born and raised in California is from a person born and raised in Mississippi, for example. It's
Right.
even in the same nation, you're totally different depending on like the geography and the location of where you were born. And so Indigenous tribes are nations. We have our own governments. My tribe, we have our own chairman. We have a court with a judge. We have lawyers. We have a system where we vote and put people in place. We have police. And so we are a nation. And so just as much as a person from France is different from a person from Nigeria, is the way that you can think about Indigenous nations. We have different languages, different cultures, different things we eat, different ways we talk, different personalities, even. And not necessarily to typecast Lumbees, but we are typically like loud and like in your face. And there are tribes in North Carolina that are more reserved. And not to say, all Lumbees are loud, or all tribes in North
Right.
Carolina like have reserved people, but there was this funny story of this group. It was a group of Indigenous people that were going to DC, and there were 7 Lumbees in the car and 1 Saponi. And Saponi is also a nation in North Carolina. And the Saponi person was just kind of like sitting in the back of the bus, like, oh God, well, all these Lumbees are like talking and being loud and using their hands like I'm doing now. So we can be kind of overwhelming when in a large group. But yeah, we're totally different from one another. And even, being a Southern person like I am, I eat Southern foods, and a lot of foods that people think of as Southern are actually Indigenous foods. So like cornbread or
Mhm.
grits, those are like totally Indigenous things. And again, totally different from what a person would eat if they were like born and raised in New York City, for example. So
Right.
that's a really good way to think about the differences between tribes. Geography matters, but also, again, even in the context of the state, Lumbees are totally different from other tribes in the state, even though we all have commonalities of land is very important to us, community and family are very important, but other than that, we have a lot of differences.
Yeah, and I know a lot of this can just be built on simple ignorance. Myself, for example, I have never met a single native person until I went to college.
Right.
And, it's just one of those things of, well, I should say, I've met the people whose great grandmother was Cherokee, you
Right.
know, but no one who was like able to say, like, oh, yes, these are my people, like, this is my family, like, these are what my family reunions are like, or like my gatherings are like with my family or whatnot.
Right.
It's just someone who is claiming this thing just to claim it. um, and I definitely had a lot of those misconceptions based purely off of ignorance and stereotypes that I'd seen in the movies and whatnot. And it wasn't until one of my closest friends started going to Pembroke, then I met a lot of Lumbee people, and I was just
Yeah.
like, this is fun. I went to my first powwow was the intertribal powwow back in what, 2019, I believe it was. That was here in Dix Park in Raleigh,
Yeah.
and it was such an amazing time. Getting to see all of the differences between all of these different tribes of people, but also, as you mentioned, the similarities that there are all these themes that every tribe has that are all uniting. And so, it's the best way to learn is to be open, to admit and recognize that a lot of the things that you know are probably just based off of stereotypes, and that you don't actually know, these or people, and get to know someone.
Right.
um, and so, yeah, that's, I'm glad that you are having these conversations and your research is focusing on these conversations. Um, and so, what could you say with your research has been one of the most surprising findings?
That's a good question. Sometimes I'm surprised by stories that people tell me. So I know that most people learn about Indigenous people in a very problematic ways. I know that, but sometimes I'm genuinely surprised, like the story that I mentioned earlier with the coloring sheets where they cut off the pictures of their family and pasted them on top. That really shocked me. That like a person would think that up. That's almost like diabolical in my mind. Um, that's yeah, that I was speechless when she told me that. There was another time with my students where I was kind of doing a talking circle with them to find out what they learned about in school about Indigenous people, and one person told me that they were going to some kind of like Indian mound, which I went to when I was in school too. There was like some Indian mound in North Carolina. I don't actually even know what an Indian mound is, to be honest with you, but like we went and it's like we saw some artifacts and stuff. So again, situating Indigenous people always in the context of like the super duper past. But she
Yeah.
said they were going to a mound and they were about to get on the bus, and then their teachers came out dressed in like native costumes from Party City, and they were doing like the where you put your hand on your mouth and make the native
Yeah.
noise thing. And then their teachers kidnapped them and forced them on the bus, and then took them to the mound. So like their teachers did a fake kidnapping of them to like mimic, I don't know, natives kidnapping people. Like I don't really know. But she said that she told her her mom about it, her mom and dad about it after the fact, and she was like, it felt like strange to me. And her parents just kind of excused it and said, oh, they were probably just trying to like, get into character before you went on the trip. So very odd things like that I hear that are like even deeper than just erasing Indigenous history, like where teachers are like putting so much effort into maintaining the stereotype that they would like spend their hard-earned money on buying native costumes or like kidnapping kids or um, things like that shock me and really surprise me, because I sometimes I'm shocked at how involved and how deep these stereotypes run that a teacher would do something like that.
Yeah, that, there's so many layers of problematic things there of, you know, buying a costume at Party City. Like this,
Right.
people's culture is not a costume.
Right.
Why would these teachers think that this is okay? And there's just a lot. There's a lot to
Yeah.
unpack there. Um, and so as we're starting to get to time, I do want to have let others have the opportunity to ask you any questions. So we'll start to wrap things up here. So thanks everyone for joining us. If you want to speak to Dr. Hunt directly, just hang on until we stop the recording, and then you can unmute yourselves and turn on your camera. And we might be having our last session. This might be our last session, or we might have one more on May 26th. So if you all are planning to join us again, thank you so much for coming. And yeah, so we're all good.
Awesome. Thank